I'm excited to be speaking with Joseph Chow, Assistant Professor at NYU Panel Civil and Urban Engineering Department with affiliations at the Center for Urban Science and Progress and the Rudin Center for Transportation Policy Management. Professor Chow is an NSF Career Award recipient, a former Canada Research Chair, and the co-founding Deputy Director of the C2SMART Center. Above me, at least on my screen, is Professor Rae Zimmerman, Research Professor at NYU's Wagner Graduate School of Public Service and Professor Emeritus there. He's previously served as Director of Wagner's Urban Planning Program and has held the role of Director of the Institute for Civil Infrastructure Systems, ICIS. Her research areas encompass environmental quality, environmental health risk management, and urban infrastructure in the context of the quality of life in cities. And finally, it's a pleasure to speak with Saar Golde, Chief Data Scientist at Via Transportation, a transit technology company you'll hear a lot about today. Previously, Saar built and led the data science practice at the IT consultancy Knowledgeance, was the first analytics solution architect for Revolution Analytics, which is now part of Microsoft, and served as the chief economist of the virtual world of Gaia Online. Saar has also taught big data in finance as an adjunct professor for NYU Camden's Master's in Financial Engineering program. So without further ado, let's get started. And maybe starting with Professor Chow and then Professor Zimmerman, and Saar, you can feel free to jump in. Can you start off by telling us about the research project you've been working on together?
Yeah, thanks, John. Really excited to be here today. I have some slides that I prepared, so maybe I'll start by just putting up the screen for that.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, so you can see this all right. We started this project a year ago. This was a collaboration with VIA, where we were trying to understand the role of microtransit in different cities at the same time. So a lot of the studies that have been conducted thus far have been looking at microtransit a city at a time. We thought that this could be an opportunity to really work with VIA to better understand this phenomenon of these microtransit services. So this work here, I just have a few slides to kind of summarize what the project entailed, and then afterwards we can talk a little bit more about this project as well as microtransit in general. Rae, Professor Zimmerman, she'll have a few slides where she can talk as well. So this is work that I did with Professor Zimmerman as a co-PI, and on this team we also included 3 PhD students, Shusti Rath, Bing-Ching Chloe Liu, and Gyugun Yoon. I think they're in attendance as well. So just to start off, maybe Saar can also elaborate on this later on too. Just to get everyone on the same page. When we talk about microtransit, we're talking about either public or private transportation services that are dynamically routed or scheduled, generally in response to demand from users. So that's the key, I believe, in microtransit, and it is a type of demand responsive transit. But the point here is that microtransit services make use of real-time exchange-based technology. So that's something that really hasn't really taken hold until the last few years. So when we look at microtransit technology and how it's been deployed, a really good example is VIA, because they've really made a lot of different deployments in various markets around the world. So this roadmap illustrates some of those deployments. And here I highlight within even the US, there's about a couple dozen deployments. But when you think about how there are so many different cities around, even within the US, right? Looking at populations of 100,000 or more, there are over 300 cities with this kind of population. And so when we think about which cities would benefit more, which cities might benefit less from having microtransit services, and in what kind of configurations would those microtransit services really take the most advantage of that city structure and the way that people are traveling to really provide the most benefit. That's really the question that we're interested in addressing. So this brings us to some of the research questions that started out from this project at the outset. One of the questions that we were very interested in was which cities would benefit from having microtransit operations and by how much. And when we talk about benefits, this isn't just congestion reduction, it's also equitable access, greenhouse gas emissions reductions, and so forth, right? And related to that, how are the deployments impacted by VIA in terms of their operating policies, like having different types of policies, how would they impact these deployments? So looking at policies related to, for example, their virtual stops, the design of those stops, looking at fare pricing, looking at idle vehicle positioning, and so forth. How do we quantify these impacts if we're to look at a collective of different city deployments? How would we be able to quantify the benefits for that whole portfolio of deployments for different cities? So that this would look at this question at a higher level. And related to the part of the question of today's session is about the multimodal environment. So when we talk about microtransit, we've seen that microtransit can provide a benefit in terms of being a connector for first and last mile service, where people at maybe less dense locations, they might have less access to fixed route transit, and this can really provide that linkage between for people who don't really have that full access. But when we look at these kind of deployments, we want to be able to understand, how much of a role do they actually play? So how much can microtransit actually fulfill that role of being a first last mile connector? So these are some of the questions, and Rae can actually emphasize a little bit more on the multimodal aspect. So I'll let Rae talk a little bit here.
Yeah, hi. I think multimodal transportation is a critical context for van services and ride sharing, for example, that VIA offers. One thing that is very important is that the number of multimodal connections are likely very much influenced by urban density. The more dense, not only size, but density, the higher the density, the more interconnections that are being offered. Now on the left side, I don't know what is everybody looking at. You see various kinds of modes, transit, rail, bus. This is just within cities. It doesn't include long range rail and trucks. Individual automobiles, bike share, and so forth, and walking as well. I think that got lost at the bottom. But what these different modes are used for very much depends on the type of trip, and the length of the trip and the cost of the trip, which is what the research that Joseph is leading gets into. So there's work, school, shopping, recreation, food, emergency services, and automobiles are used for most of these things. Initially, ride sharing, van services might have been emphasizing work trips, emergency trips. But if you move over to the other side with the dotted lines and the dashed lines, there's a tremendous potential for using different modes and making connections. So if you connect bikes, transit, and walking to van services, you can get a lot of mileage. You can use the van services, any ride sharing services to increase the connectivity for different types of trips. And again, this will depend on equity considerations, cost, you'd want to build a lot of that into the model here or the framework here to see what's going on. So that is the kind of work I do, the kind of research that feeds into what this project is doing. You can expand the ride-sharing van services if you can connect up to a lot of the existing modes that are very common in cities today.
Thank you, Rae. So this project that we embarked on, essentially, we're still wrapping it up right now. So some of the results are still ongoing, and we're trying to finish things up hopefully by May. But 1 year into this project, what this essentially involves is the previous slide before Rae's slide. We mentioned that some of those research questions that we have, it's difficult to answer them without sufficient data availability. And so the way that we thought about this is that in the analogy, if you look at images and you try to look at them in detail, right? So you try to upscale them. There are algorithms that you can use to try to infer and fill in those gaps. And so in this process of trying to understand microtransit, the role that they play in different cities, we're essentially making use of simulation algorithms and using that to fill in those similar gaps. So for example, we might have some limited data in terms of ridership numbers or vehicle utilization rates and public data, right, for different cities around the country. But we don't have as readily available data like the degree of first or last mile access, the fleet sizes that are being used, the average travel journey times in terms of breakdown for weight, access, in-vehicle time, fleet vehicle miles traveled, or other derivative measures like greenhouse gas emissions and so forth. So what we can do is working with VIA, they were able to share some data with us so that they can kind of get us started, right? Where they lend us some data for a couple of cities to the extent that we're able to build up and calibrate this simulation algorithm so that we can then apply it at much larger scale to generate a large number of data outputs from scenarios that are generated from those initial cities that VIA shared data with. So this is just like a high-level overview of the way the various data and models interact with each other, where we have this market equilibrium model that is the simulation that generates the simulated data. And then we have a scenario generator that generates the different scenarios that we're using the market equilibrium model to make predictions for. And this output information is then fed into a forecast model to calibrate that model so that ultimately we can generate for any portfolio of cities, city deployments, the various output measures like ridership, fleet size, vehicle miles traveled. So that's what this project was about. And the next couple of slides just goes over some overall results, and it's not, I don't go over them in detail, but just to kind of whet the appetites of the audience. And if anyone is interested later on, you can always reach out to me to follow up, and I can provide more details later. But we were able to use public data and some of the data that VIA shared with us to calibrate demand models. These are choice models for different modes for a variety of cities across the US. We then took those models and integrated them into these within day simulators that we had developed in a prior project for the Federal Transit Administration. So with that simulator that we developed, we are able to make changes to parameters like average demand levels, the simulation period, the length of time for each time step, average speeds, capacities of vehicles, dwell time, even the walking limits for passengers to be picked up so that we can put in virtual stops for these simulations. So when you integrate the within-day simulator along with the demand model and allow for the travelers to adjust their behavior and learn over time through another simulation process, we can eventually reach market equilibrium. And so that's the basis for this simulation procedure that we developed and implemented here. This just illustrates how the simulation shows initial fleet sizes or travel times for the travelers and how they adapt over time based on adjustments that the population would have in choosing to take VIA or not each day and as they learn the performance. So based on that initial development, we estimated we're able to estimate these metrics for these calibrated simulations for these 6 cities, as you can see. And one of the key outputs that we really found insightful was that we can actually break out the % of trips that are being made, whether they are direct trips within the region, the service region of the VIA, or whether it's connection trips, right? First and last mile trips that are that people are taking from those locations within the service region to a transit station that they then take to another location in the larger area, as you can see here. Again, I won't dwell on the details, so if you have questions in the future, you can always follow up with me. So having developed that, we also have developed a scenario generation tool that allows us to generate a variety of different scenarios based on the seed data from those 6 cities, so that we can use that to generate a large number of samples that we can then tune a forecast model. And ultimately, the plan right now, we're in the process of doing this, is to develop a portfolio analysis forecast model, and we can use that once we have any portfolio of different cities with the public data, we can then use that to forecast various measures like ridership and VMT and the derivative measures. So that's an overview of what this project has been about so far. Right now we're in the middle of March, and we're planning to complete the simulations scenarios by end of March, finish the forecast model by end of April, and have the project essentially completed for the C2SMART deliverable. And we'll hope to refine it a little bit more during the summer to submit for publication. Okay, and that sums up the overview of what this project entails. Rae, perhaps you might have a few other words to add to this.
Just, when you look into the use of different travel modes by city, it is so vastly different. I mean, obviously, New York City, it's dominated by transit, subways. Other cities don't even have it, or they have light rail. Biking and walking are more common in some cities than others. And I think the nice thing about this project is it goes right down into the to the city level, and we can integrate the modes into the model as another step. Yeah.
And the interesting thing, during this research, we also found other studies that have looked at comparing different types of cities, and there are different classifications that can be identified. So if we're able to find representative clusters of different types of cities, we might be able to compare them even more accurately in the future. So yeah, John.
Yeah, so for those who just joined, I'd encourage you to ask questions throughout. The format is just I'll ask the panelists the questions that I prepared, and as soon as we have a nice queue of questions from the audience, we'll turn it over to those questions. This next one, I guess, is for maybe Saar. You can start us off. If I'm understanding the research correctly, Professor Chow and Professor Zimmerman, these 6 cities are chosen. They're very different from one another, but VIA has robust data and a strong presence in these cities. So the places where microtransit is heavily deployed. To the extent that you're involved in this process, Saar, how does VIA choose where and what kinds of transportation services to deploy?
So it really depends on, basically we work in partnership with the city, with the local transit authority or the local transportation provider. And so it's a process of kind of selecting the right use cases, the right service parameters, the service area, the price point, all of that all of those parameters are determined together with our local partners, based sometimes on their goals, and sometimes their goals are ridership, sometimes their goals are more geared towards kind of coverage and providing access or accessibility. Sometimes the goals are stated as first and last mile services, kind of earlier in the life cycle of those projects. If it was kind of first last mile service, we used to focus on kind of tailoring the service area so that it serves specific areas. What we are doing these days in the past couple of months is actually integrating the public transit data and allowing intermodal trips to also show up in the app and doing pay integration as well. But basically the use case is chosen by the city. In some places like Birmingham, Alabama, it's more about providing equitable service than providing other goals. So based on these goals, we do a lot of different simulations. We analyze kind of the available transportation, and we try to tailor the service so that it augments it in the most useful form in order for our partners to fulfill their goals.
So you mentioned a couple of, there's a huge diversity of use cases that VIA is involved in. Can you talk about one or two that you think are like particularly successful or representative of a possible future of microtransit? I know the other day we were speaking about the school bus program in the Upper East Side of New York City, or recent implementation in Israel during COVID-19 pandemic. Can you talk about any of those?
Sure. So basically, our technology knows how to do efficient routing in either real time or offline of buses, and it works both for kind of ride sharing use cases, but it works in any other case where you need a very dynamic set, where the demand for transportation services changes rapidly. So one of those cases is school buses. We have, at least in New York City, so the Department of Education of the city of New York contracted VIA to build kind of the next version of the school bus service, which if you think about kind of how school buses work, school buses go around, they pick up kids and they drop them off at specific schools, and then they go up for kind of another round. And what people usually kind of don't know is that there's a lot of changes, both day to day and over time, in the demand patterns of school kids. There are kids specifically move around quite a bit, even more so when it comes to kids who use the school buses, at least in New York. Some of them have kind of complex custody arrangements. So some days they go from one place to school, and some other days they go from other places. And also kids and families generally move a lot. There are a lot of homeless kids, or I think there's a better term for it now, but a lot of homeless kids that go to public schools and use the school buses to get there. And they move from shelter to shelter very frequently. So you have to kind of think about, if you think about the equivalent in fixed route bus lines, right? You have to redesign your whole system basically twice a week. And being able to do that at scale is something that our kind of more dynamic system that's also used, it's the same type of algorithms that are used for planning kind of microtransit services. And another example of where this kind of dynamic or being able to dynamically respond to changing demand is our service in Israel, which we have a service in Tel Aviv that covers about, in normal times, about 2/3 of the greater area, the Tel Aviv area. But once the first lockdown, the first COVID lockdown hit, basically all of public transit in Israel was shut down. And within 12 hours, we were able to quadruple our service area. So we had about 100 different vehicles going around. We quadrupled the service area and turned it into a service that allows essential employees, and specifically hospital employees, to get to work without their private cars. So we quadrupled the service area and allowed only specific people to use the service, but it allowed a few, I think it was hundreds of riders on the first days to basically make it to work in all of the hospitals in the greater Tel Aviv area. And again, if you think about kind of the normal process of redesigning a transportation system, usually takes years. And it took us about 12 hours to actually allow that to work, allowing hospital employees to get to work without their private cars in cases they didn't have any. And so cases like that's where kind of dynamic systems kind of shine, right? Like you can respond to drastically changing demand in real time and overnight.
Yeah, so the clear advantage that keeps coming up is the dynamism and the flexibility of microtransit. Where, I guess maybe we can start with Rae and then go Joe and Saar again. Where does microtransit fit? And we've been talking about it, where it fits in the multimodal ecosystem among rideshare, micromobility, and fixed route transit like buses. Does it replace any existing modes? Are you seeing modes lose prominence over time? Can you just talk about its place among the other different modes of transportation? Maybe Rae starts.
Well, I think certainly the ride sharing, the ride hailing can, it moves around, as Sarah said, you know, it's got a lot of flexibility. People can walk to where they can get these vans. They can take transit where transit stops and buses stop. And then go further, you know, a last mile or whatever, and move among the various uses that are necessary, like the emergency services or food or shopping or recreation, whatever. But they can mix and match, if you were, if you would, and then. It's a very it's a valuable, flexible option that can connect to other means of travel. However, in order to implement all this, you have to know origin and destination and trip type. Where do people come and go from, for which trips? And then van services can adapt.
Yeah, and just to add to that, so like, you know, when you think about the axis of choices, on one end you have taxis that you want to just take directly from door to door at one point to another without traveling to access or waiting too long. And then on the other end, you have to go to a fixed route transit service, and you have to walk that distance. And people are relying on the high density of the service for the service to be successful. And microtransit falls somewhere in between those 2 points. There are times when microtransit might be costlier if it's very if it's very high density or very low density ranges where it might not be as efficient to operate the on-demand service. But on the other hand, there are also many instances where it can be much more cost-effective than operating just a bus fleet on a fixed schedule, repeatedly running all those vehicle miles, right? And when we say cost, we mean both dollars as well as fuel savings, energy consumption, gas emissions, and so forth, right? So and this has been studied for many years because the demand for this kind of technology has been there since you know, the early 70s, where people have looked at these kind of dynamic, well, they didn't operate them in a dynamic fashion, but they looked at non-fixed route types of schedules where they might have to solve these the day beforehand or something like that. And even since the 80s and 90s, people have found that there are certain demand ranges and population densities where microtransit just can operate better than fixed route transit. So in terms of that, there you can find, you know, the kind of like the ideal cases where this works very well, and having it fit to the, you know, fit to fixed route transit as kind of like a connector, it just opens up more opportunities. So when we talk about transit deserts and how some, you know, especially during COVID right now, with some essential workers not being able to get access to certain mobility, and having, you know, these options available might allow them to have more accessibility. So I think that's one of the big advantages of transit.
Yeah, there's actually also, I mean, if you think about kind of the density is a huge aspect, and if you look at the US, one of the charts that Joseph showed earlier, right, has kind of the distribution of sizes of cities. There are many more cities that can't really afford classic fixed line transit based on buses, right? It's just like the economies aren't there. And if you look at if you try to kind of do the design in the classical way, and you'd open kind of a transit planning handbook and try to adapt that to a small town with 10,000 people, you'd get a service that people have to walk about a mile to the nearest bus station, and the bus station frequency is less than once an hour, which just leads to no usage and a huge waste. And so in cases like that, which actually are very common, especially in the US, they're kind of textbook examples for where microtransit could work, to either augment kind of the larger areas type of transit that exists, or just completely replace it as a viable local public transit system, which is something we have in Summit in Colorado. We have it in Arlington, Texas, things like places like that, where VIA is actually providing the local public transit service. And just like any other public transit service, it's subsidized, and it's kind of managed and overseen by the local transit authority or city.
So another question for you, Saar. The new presidential administration is placing great emphasis on electrification and on equity. And so how does VIA and VIA's current priorities fit into the administration's goals?
So we actually have a lot of experience running services that are fully electric or mainly electric. In that sense, Europe is actually a little bit ahead of the US in that, in terms of kind of the availability of small electric vehicles, not sedans, because sedans are not that easy to share rides with, but kind of electrified minivans. There are many models that are kind of licensed to drive around in Europe, but not yet as many, or almost none at all in the US. So for example, our service in Berlin initially was again, it's a service that's meant to augment the BVG, the local public transit agency. It's a joint project with them. They're our local partner. And it's basically meant to cover kind of areas where Berlin's very elaborate local transit system is lacking. And so that service was electric basically from day one. Had significant portion of it run using electric vehicles. So we went through the whole process where we, and there were many generations of that. We went through all of the learning curve and treating different bottlenecks. Initially, the bottlenecks were kind of the actual vehicle capacity, because cars could only drive for 4 hours and then they'd need 5 hours to charge. We went through the process of handling the kind of charging capacity. Initially, we only had 3 chargers for a fleet of 20 vehicles, so we had to stagger things around that. In Milton Keynes in the UK, our service is 100% electric these days. We're starting to see that coming to the US as well, but there are some limitations. So in Jersey City, we're introducing electric vehicles, but the street legal electric vehicles are only small sedans. So you can only put 3, in pre-COVID days, you could only put 3 passengers in them. Right now, we don't put any passenger next to the driver. So that already eliminates 1 out of 3. So it's, so the US is a little bit behind. When we're talking about the equity, part of our services, when we help our partners design their service, we kind of create maps of who can be served by the local public transit system. That's also something we used to do it kind of on our own, but recently we invested and bought a company called Remix, and one of their tools is a very user-friendly tool that has exactly that. So you can overlay all of the census or the American Community Survey data and kind of see the coverage of the current transit system, see where the gaps are, and see whether and then work to optimize to see if you want to increase coverage for those underserved area, mostly using fixed route buses or kind of complementary microtransit or other services. So we don't influence policy in the local at the local level, but we definitely give the local authorities and the local transportation agencies the tools to plug any holes that they have in their coverage based on their goals.
Great. So I will just quickly take a moment to say, please, you can feel free to send in your questions right now. We have about 20 minutes left. So I'm at the sort of towards the end of my questions. I have a kind of a big one. You mentioned the COVID-19 related changes, Saar. So maybe we can start with Joe and then go to Rae. The global pandemic is changing commuting patterns around the world, and we're hearing all the time the 9 to 5 commute maybe is no longer in the way, at least, of central business district that everyone goes to twice a day or to and from. So what have you changed in your mind about your vision of the future of microtransit, and what have you doubled down on?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, so it definitely has made me think about the role of shared use transportation much more since COVID started. Traditionally, our mindset has always been, try to get as many people packed together in dense setting as possible, so that there's economies of density for providing these cost-effective services. But yeah, with COVID and now we've been seeing this change, and it's reflected in not just the types of vehicles that you're using, but ultimately it's the work habits, right, are being changed. It's a large proportion of people are working from home, and even after most of the population is vaccinated, there's a possibility that because the companies have felt that they've learned that that's actually a viable way of operating, that maybe they won't fully go back to the way it has been before. This was a very interesting research question that we wanted to look into, in fact. So at the start of COVID, we worked with Professor Khan Osbey's group also to take a look at the challenges that COVID would have on how people would commute and travel, and using multi-agent simulation tools that we've developed for New York City. And we were seeing that it was really impacting, the way that they were making choices in the mode, shifting it away from shared use, to the extent that if the population were to kind of jump back into like a full commute in the future, that could really exacerbate the congestion situation in traffic. And so when we think about how we can try to shift back in the next few months or years. We should really think about how we can manage that traffic and how people might make use of other modes. We're seeing a lot more dependency on micromobility as well. So it'll be interesting. Maybe Saar can talk about whether micromobility might be something to consider within VIA in the future as well. So that's, yeah, great.
Yeah, so Rae, you want to go ahead, please?
Yeah, well, as everyone knows, sort of the long distance modes of travel like subways, buses, relatively long distance, have gone down precipitously since the pandemic started. They're beginning to come back up. What was taking their place to a large extent was, again, the walking, the solitary modes, the walking, the biking, scooters, and all of the different modes that people use to get around. But it actually automobile travel went up substantially, because it was the one way people could ride alone and get somewhere, and on a longer distance. But if we could have inserted in there a flexible system that expanded and contracted the length of the trips, like a van service could accommodate people walking, people could go to the stops where those other modes would go, that would have enhanced a lot of flexibility and enabled people to go where they wanted to go. But again, the research area, you need to know a lot about origin and destination and types of trips in order to fit all these pieces together. And the nice thing is, if you have something, a mode that is mobile, that can get people to move around. Now, whether sharing will come back again after the, with increased vaccination, that's going to be a big open question.
Saar, what have you maybe changed your mind on, and what have you doubled down on since the pandemic in terms of microtransit?
So one thing that's pretty clear is that that transportation and people's commute patterns are going to change. They have changed a lot, and they're going to change. So again, it highlights the need to just be very nimble in terms of kind of changing the available transit schedules, lines, whether it's fixed lines or the microtransit option. It just means if you think about kind of people going to work a couple of days a week, right, or just changing how many people go to work and where they go to work, it's going to affect all transportation systems around the world significantly. So that's why one of the big investments we made just recently is to buy the company Remix that does that builds tools to do planning for fixed line services, and the tools to do analysis to figure out what is the right mixture between microtransit and fixed lines in order to optimize both either coverage or environmental impact or any other kind of social outcome. We definitely think that things are going to be different. No one's exactly sure how different it is going to be and how long it's going to take to get there. There are some recent changes that that are happening, like private vehicle ownership, at least specifically in New York City, went up significantly. So I think the days of curb management, more aggressive curb managements, are to the degree that the political process will allow it, are going to come finally, and I think it's just going to be a very big difference. The problem is that once people buy cars, it takes a long time to get rid of those cars, and so we have to make sure that the local transit system everywhere is attractive in terms of the ease of use, not just the economics and the environmental impact, but also the ease of use, which is something that microtransit is actually always very good at. It's very tunable. It's very easy to just say, you know, we're going to add 20% more vehicles, and then quality of service goes up by a certain percentage. Yeah.
And
I
you
have
know,
a question.
one thing we haven't really discussed is that in order for the microtransit and other forms of transportation to interface, you need a very good communication system. People have to know where the different things are, and then some public-private relationships. Some of these things are private, individual private, company private, and then you've got massive public systems in transit. So they need to be able to cooperate and be able to establish linkages among them.
Okay, so we have 2 audience questions, and the second one looks to be quite large. So not that this one couldn't be large either. So Saar, you've been mentioning the synergy between VIA and local public transit agencies. This question is particularly about public transit ridership, maybe overall, but can you talk about what happened, so when Uber and Lyft were introduced, local public transit usage went down. Can you talk about how the introduction of VIA to communities plays out in terms of public transit usage, and maybe the bottom line for social welfare, the social outcomes that you're interested in?
Sure. So again, in most cases, we work our client is the local transit authority or the local transit operator. So we definitely never want to see anything like that. So in some places, what we do in order to make sure that doesn't happen is we define a service as a first mile, last mile service. So for example, King County in Seattle, in Washington, which is Seattle, Washington, our service is defined as a first last mile to the light rail, I think, or the local train. Basically, the service is designed as such that it can't actually cannibalize anything. If you can request a ride either to the train station or from the train station, you can't actually take a ride between any 2 random points, right? In Jersey City, the service is designed such that you can take a ride within the central city area. You can take a ride basically from zones outside the city center to the city center, or from the city center to outside the city center. But within the city center where transit is dense, it's just impossible, and we filter out those requests. The same thing we have now in Detroit, again, where we actually show in the app itself, we show both the public transit options and the microtransit options. And very soon we'll also enable kind of intermodal trip, which have one part of microtransit and another part public transit. Basically, we work with the local agencies to make sure that VIA enhances the transportation options. And in some cases, it actually means that when when someone requests a ride from one point to another, we might, even though there might be a vehicle that could take that ride, we might not show it, or we might not show it because there are other options that are just as good. And so we actually give the public transit options, or the fixed line options, or all of it is public transit to a certain degree. We give the fixed line options preferential treatment, either in the place they're presented in the app. Sometimes we just don't show the microtransit option. And in some cases, we price trips in a differential way, so that in case a trip is easily accessible by existing fixed line transit, the microtransit price just goes up significantly. That's another option. So we work with the local, with our local partners to make sure that basically their goals met, and if their goals are to eliminate the chance of cannibalization of service, then we build a service around that. The one thing that does happen is that once you actually contrast those two options, you see how bad the coverage of the fixed line transit is in many places around the country. So it's so even though so basically you can get kind of like the opposite of a halo effect. You see, you basically get kind of a contrast of really good service of one type and really bad service of another type, and then in other times, even if the good service doesn't exist, the bad service still gets kind of a reality check about the quality of service. So that's kind of an unpleasant side effect.
Sure. All right, so this is maybe quite a large one. What do you think is the current state of the art, maybe from both the academic research perspective and the industry perspective, in terms of the network design problem for planning fixed line transit in the context of demand responsive feeder systems? Anyone want to take this?
I can talk about the academic perspective.
Sure.
I see, yeah, this is from Samita, professor at Cornell. So thanks for the question. Yeah, this, I mean, as I know that there hasn't been that much in the past, too much work from like the public transit design, network design side that incorporates the demand responsive feeder access as well. I think there's been more recently from the demand responsive side, where you optimize those services dynamically. You might incorporate the transit operations incorporate into the network design. I think, in fact, Samita's group has done something with that as well. And I've seen some work from TU Delft, the Katz's group, and I think Avi Cedar's group as well. So there's been just a few studies where they've really had integrated network design considerations. And I think the challenge is the scalability, right, of having these algorithms that can really come out with effective designs that can address the needs of the city agencies. So that, yeah, that's kind of where I've seen where we're at. I mean, we've also published some work in the past, but primarily from like the demand responsive side. And I think there's still a lot of opportunity looking at the way that agencies and companies like VIA can really collaborate and work together to make sure that, you know, the services are integrated, not just in terms of having the routes or like the service synchronized, but also in terms of pricing, which Saar also pointed out is something that they've been doing. But yeah, when we look at like service region design, it can be a very challenging problem. So.
Yeah, I think network theory really lends itself very well to this problem with nodes and links or edges, and you know, shrinking some, enlarging some, really has a good potential for analyzing, you know, this kind of microtransit and other, you know, other interfaces.
Saar, did you want to add something?
Yeah, so we actually do quite a bit of that work as well. A couple of examples that come to mind are Hall County, Georgia. I think the town is called Gainesville, but basically we have we helped them initially design and then launch the actual service, where they had 5 local bus lines and kind of call ahead demand response service, and we helped them redesign that service, unify some of, basically we kept 2 lines the way they were and combined 3 other lines into 1 line and augmented everything with a demand response system. Did something very similar in Summit, Colorado. Another third place is Bakersfield, California, with Grand Empire Transit, where now they have both kind of again, a service where they changed the dispersion of and the lines and the schedules of some of their fixed lines and replace some of the kind of peripheral service with the demand response service. So I would like to think that we're kind of, state of that what we do is state of the art in terms of implementation. Being the current market leader in that space leads me to think that maybe we probably are. But that's, I can't actually talk about kind of the techniques we use and stuff like that, but we do that all the time, and it proves out to be very successful in terms of ridership numbers and rider experience. And a big part of it is also another big part that you can't ever ignore when you're doing any change like that is the community engagement, and you have to actually kind of work with the local community in order to explain how things are going to work. You have to have a very comprehensive service that would make sure that, for example, people without smartphones can still ride. People without credit cards can still ride. Things that are usually kind of things that would make it look and feel like a real public transit system that is just newer and compatible with us being in the 21st century, but still doesn't leave behind different populations with different limitations, either unbanked or with no mobile phones, all sorts of limitations and disabilities and so forth.
Can't think of a better way to end. And I mean, there was another 4 questions I could have asked just about that alone. Thank you so much to Saar Golde and Professors Chow and Zimmerman. It was great talking with you today.